Good evening. The autumn air over Windsor carried a quiet tension that even the ancient stone walls seemed to feel. Princess Charlotte, only 9 years old but already possessing a keen awareness beyond her years, stood near the tall window of the drawing room. Outside, the gardens stretched endlessly, manicured and serene. Inside, however, her small hands were clenched tightly at her sides. She had learned in recent months to stay quiet, not out of obedience but out of caution. Queen Camilla entered the room with her usual composed presence, her footsteps measured, her expression unreadable. She carried herself with the authority of someone who had fought long and hard to stand where she did. Charlotte, she said, her voice smooth but firm, you're late again for your etiquette session. Charlotte turned slowly. I wasn't told it was today, she replied, carefully choosing her words. Camilla's lips tightened, just slightly. In this family, she said, you're expected to know. It wasn't the words alone, it was the tone, the weight behind them, the way they seemed to linger longer than necessary. Charlotte lowered her gaze, but inside, something flickered. This wasn't the first time. To outsiders, everything appeared perfect. Photographs showed smiling faces, coordinated outfits, laughter on balconies, and unity in public appearances. But within the private halls of the palace, Charlotte had begun to feel a quiet pressure, a constant sense of being watched, corrected, measured. Stand straighter, speak less, smile properly. Royalty is not a playground. Each comment, small on its own, began to stack like invisible stones. Charlotte tried to confide in her older brother George, but he was burdened with his own expectations. Louis, too young, only offered laughter and distraction, so she said nothing until the day she couldn't. Carole Middleton arrived at Windsor on a crisp morning, her presence warm and grounding, like a breath of fresh air in a place that often felt too heavy. She noticed it immediately. Charlotte ran to her, as she always did, but this time the hug lingered longer. Too long. Carol knelt slightly, pulling back to look at her granddaughter's face. What's wrong, darling? She asked softly. Charlotte hesitated. Years of royal conditioning clashed with the simple instinct to tell her grandmother everything. Nothing, she said, but Carol Middleton had raised her own children. She knew that look, and she didn't believe her for a second. It happened later that afternoon. They were alone in a smaller sitting room, away from the formalities, away from the watching eyes. Carol poured tea, her movements calm, deliberate. You know, she said gently, you can tell me anything. Charlotte stared at her cup. For a moment, silence. Then, she doesn't like me. Carol's hand paused. Who doesn't like you? She asked carefully. Charlotte's voice dropped. Queen Camilla. The room seemed to still. Carol didn't react immediately, not outwardly, but inside something sharp and protective ignited. Why would you say that? She asked, keeping her tone even. Charlotte swallowed. She's always correcting me, telling me I'm not good enough, that I have to try harder than everyone else. Her voice cracked slightly. She says I'm too spirited. That word lingered in the air. Carol's expression changed, subtly at first, but unmistakably. The warmth in her eyes sharpened into something else, something fierce. Carol Middleton had never been one to seek confrontation, but she had always been one to protect her family. And in that moment, sitting across from a child who suddenly seemed far too small for the weight she was carrying, something inside her snapped into place. This wasn't about protocol. This wasn't about hierarchy. This was about her granddaughter, and she would not stand by. It happened that evening. The royal drawing room was quiet, dimly lit, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken rules. Queen Camilla stood near the fireplace reviewing documents when Carol entered. There was no announcement, no formal introduction, just presence. Your Majesty, Carol said. Camilla looked up, mildly surprised, but composed. Mrs. Middleton, she replied, I wasn't expecting. I think we need to talk. There was no hostility in Carol's voice, but there was no softness either. Camilla studied her for a moment. Then slowly, she set the papers aside. Very well. Carol didn't sit. She stood tall, unwavering. I've just spoken with Charlotte, she began. Camilla's expression barely changed. Children can be sensitive, she said lightly. This isn't sensitivity, Carole replied. This is distress. A pause. Camilla's gaze sharpened. You're making a serious implication. I'm stating a fact, Carole said. She feels constantly criticized, pressured, unwelcome. Camilla's posture stiffened. I am preparing her for royal life. And at what cost? Carole shot back. The room tightened. For the first time, there was a crack in Camilla's composure. You may not understand. I understand perfectly, Carole interrupted, her voice rising, not loud, but powerful. I raised a daughter who walked into this institution and endured more than most people ever will. I know exactly what this world demands. Camilla said nothing. Carole stepped closer. But Charlotte is a child, not a symbol, not an obligation, a child. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Camilla exhaled slowly. You think I'm being cruel, she said. I think, Carole replied, you're forgetting what it feels like to be young in a place that doesn't forgive mistakes. Camilla's eyes flickered, just briefly. Something unspoken passed through her expression. I wasn't given the luxury of gentleness, she said quietly. Carole's voice softened, but only slightly. And that's exactly why she should have it. Silence, heavy, thick, then I won't have her diminished, Carole continued. Not here, not by anyone. Camilla straightened. And I won't have my role questioned in my own household. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. The confrontation didn't end in shouting. It ended in something far more unsettling, understanding, not agreement, but recognition. Two women, shaped by very different paths, standing at opposite ends of the same problem. Finally, Camilla spoke. I will reconsider my approach. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Carole nodded once. That's all I'm asking. The next morning felt different, subtly, almost imperceptibly. When Charlotte entered the room, Camilla looked at her, not critically, not measuring, but seeing. Good morning, Charlotte, she said. Charlotte hesitated. Good morning, she replied. There was no correction, no comment, just quiet. And for the first time in weeks, Charlotte felt something unfamiliar in that room. Relief. The palace returned to its rhythm. Appearances continued. Smiles were exchanged. Cameras flashed. But beneath it all, something had shifted. Carole Middleton returned home, carrying with her the quiet satisfaction of someone who had drawn a line and held it. Charlotte stood a little taller, not because she had been told to, but because someone had reminded the world that she didn't need to earn her place. She already had it. And somewhere, deep within the walls of Windsor, even Queen Camilla reflected on a truth she had long forgotten. Strength wasn't always about control. Sometimes it was about kindness. Princess Charlotte and the Storm at Windsor Part 2, Whispers Behind Palace Doors. The change was subtle, but in a place like Windsor, subtle changes were everything. For Princess Charlotte, the air felt lighter, not completely free, but no longer suffocating. That morning, as sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the breakfast room, she sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. She waited, almost instinctively, for the usual correction, but it didn't come. Queen Camilla entered, her posture as composed as ever. The room stilled slightly, as it always did in her presence. Staff moved with precision. Trays were placed, tea was poured. Charlotte glanced up. Good morning, Your Majesty, she said carefully. Camilla paused. For a brief moment, something softened in her expression. Good morning, Charlotte. No critique, no adjustment, just words. Charlotte blinked, almost as if she didn't quite trust what she had heard. Across the table, Prince William noticed, and so did Catherine. Later that day, Catherine found her daughter in the garden, sitting beneath an old oak tree. Charlotte was tracing patterns in the gravel with the tip of her shoe, deep in thought. Catherine approached quietly, sitting beside her. You seem different today, she said gently. Charlotte shrugged. I think things are better. Catherine studied her carefully. Better how? Charlotte hesitated. She didn't correct me. It was such a small sentence, but it carried so much weight. Catherine's heart tightened. She wrapped an arm around Charlotte, pulling her close. Well, she said softly, that's a good start, isn't it? Charlotte nodded, but there was still uncertainty in her eyes, because children, even strong ones, remember. Inside the palace, however, not everyone viewed the shift as a positive one. Royal households run on structure, hierarchy, and, above all, control. Any disruption, no matter how small, creates ripples. And Carol Middleton's confrontation had created more than ripples, it had created whispers. They say she walked in without announcement, raised her voice, I heard. To the Queen, no less. Staff spoke in hushed tones, careful not to be overheard, but unable to resist the intrigue. At the center of it all was Camilla, and she knew it. That evening, Camilla sat alone in her private sitting room. No aides, no advisors, just silence. She held a book in her lap, but she hadn't turned a page in several minutes. Carol's words replayed in her mind. She's a child, not a symbol. Camilla exhaled slowly. It wasn't the accusation that unsettled her, it was the truth buried within it. She had spent years learning how to survive within the institution, years hardening herself against criticism, judgment, and relentless scrutiny. Gentleness had never been a luxury she could afford, so she hadn't learned how to give it. Her gaze drifted to the window. The palace, for all its grandeur, suddenly felt smaller. Prince William had remained silent during the confrontation, outwardly, but he had been listening, observing. And now, as he stood in his study, he made a decision. He requested a private audience. It was less explosive, but no less significant. Thank you for seeing me, William said, stepping into the room. Camilla nodded. Of course. There was no hostility between them, but there was tension, unspoken, careful. William didn't sit. I want to talk about Charlotte. Camilla's expression remained neutral. I assumed you might. A pause. William chose his words carefully. She's strong, he said, more than people realize. Camilla tilted her head slightly. Yes, I've noticed. But she's also 9, William added. The words hung there, simple, direct. Camilla looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment she saw not just a future king, but a father. I never intended to upset her, she said. I believe you, William replied. That surprised her. But intention doesn't always match impact. Silence. William stepped closer. We're raising her to understand duty, responsibility, but also confidence, security. His voice softened slightly. She doesn't need to feel like she's constantly falling short. Camilla looked away, not defensively, but thoughtfully. I see, she said, and this time she meant it. The following days became a quiet test, not announced, not formal, but felt. Charlotte attended her lessons, participated in engagements, practiced her curtsy, her posture, her speech. But now something had shifted. Where there had once been constant correction, there was now space. Space to try, space to make small mistakes, space to breathe. And with that space, something unexpected began to grow. Confidence. It happened during a rehearsal for an upcoming public appearance. Charlotte stumbled slightly during a practiced greeting, her timing just a bit off. Before, the correction would have been immediate, sharp, precise. But this time, there was a pause. Charlotte braced herself. Then, let's try that again, Camilla said calmly. No edge, no disappointment, just instruction. Charlotte looked up, surprised. Okay, she said, and she tried again. This time she got it right. Camilla gave a small nod. Well done. 2 simple words, but to Charlotte, they meant everything. Back in Berkshire, Carole Middleton received updates, subtle ones, carefully phrased, but she could read between the lines. And when Catherine called that evening, there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Relief. She's happier, Catherine said. Carole smiled. Good, she replied. But she wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't the end of the story. Palaces didn't change overnight. Neither did people, because while Charlotte was beginning to find her footing, the world outside the palace remained unchanged. Expectations still loomed, pressures still waited. And within the walls of Windsor, dynamics were still shifting, quietly, carefully, unpredictably. Camilla, too, was changing. But change, especially in a place built on tradition, never comes without resistance. That night, Charlotte stood once again by the tall window, the same place, the same view, but she felt different, stronger, not because everything was perfect, but because someone had stood up for her, because someone had listened, because for the first time she felt seen, not as a future role, but as herself. Behind her, the door opened softly. Camilla stepped in. Charlotte turned. There was a moment, brief, uncertain. Then Camilla spoke. You handled today very well. Charlotte blinked. Thank you, she said. And this time, she believed it. Princess Charlotte and the Storm at Windsor, Part 3, The Crown Watches. The calm never lasts long in a place like Windsor. Just as Charlotte began to find her footing, just as the tension inside the palace softened into something manageable, the outside world began to stir. And the outside world was far less forgiving. It started, as these things often do, with a whisper. A single headline buried low on a gossip page. Tensions behind palace walls, sources hint at firm guidance for young royal. It didn't name Charlotte, it didn't name Camilla, but inside the palace, everyone knew, and whispers, once released, have a way of growing teeth. Within days, the story evolved. Speculation turned into narrative, narrative turned into headlines. Strict royal upbringing under question. Is the next generation under too much pressure? Inside the palace, discipline or distress? Cameras lingered longer, questions sharpened. Every glance, every gesture, every public appearance was suddenly under a microscope. And at the center of it all, a 9-year-old girl who had never asked for any of it. Charlotte didn't read the headlines, but she felt them, in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, in the way staff spoke more carefully, in the way her parents exchanged quiet looks when they thought she wasn't watching. One afternoon, she turned to Catherine. Are people talking about me? Catherine paused. There it was, the question she had been dreading. Some people like to talk about things they don't understand, she said gently. Charlotte frowned. Did I do something wrong? The question hit harder than anything else. Catherine immediately pulled her close. No, she said firmly, absolutely not. But Charlotte wasn't fully convinced, because when the world starts whispering, it's hard not to listen. Meetings were held, quiet ones, behind closed doors, advisors, aides, communications teams, all working to contain a story that had already begun to spread. The narrative needs to shift. We highlight unity, no acknowledgement of internal conflict. The child must be protected at all costs. William sat through it all, his expression controlled, but his patience thinning. At one point, he spoke. She's not a narrative, he said. The room went still. She's my daughter. No one argued, but the machine of the monarchy didn't stop. It adjusted. For Camilla, the headlines carried a different weight. Not new, but familiar. Scrutiny had followed her for years, but this felt different. This wasn't about her past. This was about her present, her role, her influence, and whether she had crossed a line. She sat with one of her senior advisors. They're painting a picture, the advisor said carefully, one that may not reflect reality. Camilla gave a small, tired smile. They rarely do. Would you like to respond? Camilla looked out the window. The easy answer would have been yes, to defend, to clarify, to push back. But something stopped her. No, she said quietly. The advisor blinked. No, ma'am? Camilla shook her head. Sometimes the best response is to do better. The solution, as always, was visibility, a carefully planned public engagement, a children's charity event, bright colors, smiling faces, controlled messaging, and, most importantly, Charlotte. Cameras flashed as the royal family arrived. William, Catherine, George, Charlotte, Louis, and beside them, Queen Camilla. The atmosphere was electric, not celebratory, anticipatory, waiting, watching, looking for something, anything to confirm the story. Charlotte stepped forward, holding a small bouquet she had been given. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then she turned, not to her parents, but to Camilla, a small, instinctive gesture. Would you like to hold this? Charlotte asked. The question caught Camilla off guard, just slightly. She looked at Charlotte, really looked. And in that moment, there was no press, no narrative, no expectation. Just a child offering something simple. Camilla's expression softened. Thank you, she said, taking the bouquet gently. Cameras captured it instantly. The image spread within minutes. The headlines shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably. A sweet moment between queen and young princess. Royal unity on display. Body language, experts note warm exchange. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't the old story either. And in the world of public perception, that mattered. Back in Berkshire, Carole Middleton watched the footage carefully. Once, twice, three times. To most people, it looked like a simple, heartwarming moment. But Carole wasn't most people. She saw the hesitation, the carefulness, the effort, and while she was relieved, she wasn't entirely reassured because she knew something others didn't. Charlotte wasn't performing, she was adapting. That evening, after the event, Charlotte sat with William in a quieter corner of the palace. You did very well today, he said. Charlotte nodded. Was it good? She asked. William smiled gently. It was more than good. Charlotte hesitated. Did I help? The question was so innocent, so sincere. William's smile faded slightly, not into sadness, but into something deeper. You don't have to help, he said. Just being yourself is enough. Charlotte looked at him. Are you sure? William placed a hand on her shoulder. I'm certain. Later that night, Camilla stood alone once more. The bouquet, Charlotte's bouquet, rested on a small table nearby. She picked it up, turning it slightly in her hands. It wasn't perfect. A few petals slightly bent, a bit uneven, but genuine, unfiltered, unforced, and somehow that made it more meaningful than anything carefully arranged. Camilla exhaled slowly. Change, she realized, didn't come from grand gestures. It came from moments like that. Small, unexpected, human. Charlotte returned to her window. The same one, always the same one. But now, when she looked out, she didn't feel quite so small. The world beyond the palace walls was still loud, still watching, still judging, but inside, something was shifting. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Behind her, footsteps approached. This time, she didn't tense. She turned. Camilla stood there, quieter than before, less imposing. Charlotte, she said, yes? A brief pause. Then, would you like to help me choose flowers for tomorrow's arrangement? Charlotte blinked, surprised. Then, a small smile. I'd like that.